Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Histories of Racial Capitalism, edited by Destin Jenkins and Justin Leroy, narrated by Janina Edwards and Jaime Lincoln-Smith. Forward. Racial Capitalism and Law. Angela P. Harris, University of California, Davis, School of Law. As the editors of this volume note, neither the racial nor the capitalism part of the term racial capitalism ought to be taken for granted. I admit, the term makes me nervous. I worry that using race as a key word will increase the fraught divide between scholars of race and scholars of settler colonialism. I also worry that the rightful association of the term with the path-breaking work of Cedric Robinson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Eric Williams will solidify a masculinist canon. And I worry that the word capitalism will not only trigger for some scholars the everlasting debate about how to define that term, but also foreclose the relevance of the project to non-capitalist and/or anti-capitalist times and spaces. But in this essay, I won't dwell on worries. Instead, I'll argue that my discipline, law, is a key site for the development of new scholarship in racial capitalism, and that alliances among racial capitalism scholars in the humanities and social sciences and racial capitalism scholars in law have the potential to fruitfully disrupt some of the discourses that sustain neoliberal governance. As this volume illustrates, an important strand of the new racial capitalism literature traces the historical role of white supremacy in the processes of dispossession, extraction, accumulation, and exploitation that are central to today's capitalism. The editor's introduction articulates the bold premise of this work. Racial subjugation is not a special application of capitalist processes, but rather central to how capitalism operates. The implications of this literature for legal studies are intriguing. Legal scholarship and teaching circulate simultaneously in the university and in the larger networks of the profession. Within the university, law interacts with many other disciplines, including those in the humanities and the social sciences. For example, critical race theory, CRT, emerged in the 1980s as a university-facing flow, drawing on critical legal studies and on third world studies. Over the next few decades, it moved into the social sciences and the humanities. Through some combination of these paths, critical race theory has now filtered into the world of progressive social movements and the nonprofit industrial complex that supports them. In mainstream professional discourse, however, where legal codes structure the institutions and actors of capitalist democracy, law's most powerful disciplinary alliance has been with economics. The romance, moreover, is largely one way. Enjoying remarkable prestige and power in both academia and governance, economics as a discipline takes little notice of any other non-hard discipline, save, in a limited way, cognitive psychology. The fiefdom-defending capacities of economics extend to its offshoot in the legal academy, law and economics, which continues to hold sway over research and teaching in all the fields that touch markets, from business associations to securities regulation, to intellectual property, to contracts, to international trade. Capitalism doesn't exist in these fields. There are only markets and economic analysis, abstract systems obeying rules that are elegant, timeless, and inherently disconnected from matters of distribution. Lately, though, there's been a series of disturbances in the force. The shock of the Great Recession of 2008, the slow creep of climate change, and most recently, the cascading assaults of the COVID-19 pandemic have all undermined the neoliberal political economic consensus, as has the post-racial rush of xenophobic and nationalist authoritarianism around the globe. In the context of these shocks, the emergence of racial capitalism in the tiny world of the academic humanities might actually be big. Traveling through the fissures and networks of legal studies and social movements in the way CRT has, racial capitalism has the potential to amplify the shock waves from within and without. Part 1 of this essay argues that legal scholarship and teaching form an important bridge between academia and the doings of state and market governance. Part 2 imagines some moves that racial capitalism and legal studies, developing together, might make in these spaces, and in progressive organizing for non-capitalist futures. 1. The law is everywhere. Economists, I have claimed, pay little attention to other disciplines, but they really ignore race. Even Thomas Piketty's 2014 surprise blockbuster, Capital in the 21st Century, lauded for not only actually noticing economic inequality, but conceptualizing it as the result of a struggle between capital and labor, proposed universal solutions that overlooked the central role that differentials of race and gender play in shaping capitalism as a system of production. More typical in economic analysis is either the assumption that issues involving racial inequality are a matter of distribution and thus not the business of economists at all, or else earnest assurances that since racism is economically inefficient, it is bound, like other immaterial distinctions, to vanish like dew on a summer's day in the sunlight of free markets. Economists wishing to take white supremacy seriously have thus been pushed into awkward models such as positing an individual taste for discrimination. In contrast, race is everywhere in law, but it appears in legal doctrine through a recognition paradigm that assumes that the problem of white supremacy is exclusion. Anti-discrimination law, the primary place where race shows up in legal practice, provides individuals with tools with which to contest their exclusion from employment, education, and other institutions of the market and the state, when that exclusion can be proven to have been motivated by racial difference. But anti-discrimination law assumes that these institutions are otherwise race-blind and race-free. Moreover, the remedies available under anti-discrimination law are designed to forestall collective economic redistribution as a possibility. The insistence that racial rights can only be rights of recognition and assimilation has helped maintain an uneasy divide between people of color and indigenous peoples. Federally recognized Indian tribes have collective political and economic rights of self-determination, resting on their inherent sovereignty as a people that predates the formation of the United States. These powers of sovereignty, however, have been preserved in the contemporary era only through denial of their racial character. The Supreme Court has held, for example, that employment preferences for Indians in the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs are permissible because being an Indian is a political and not a racial identity. If Indian identity were deemed racial, such preferences would be clearly unconstitutional. The distinction between political and racial identity at once suppresses the racialized nature of anti-indigenous state and private action, and renders non-justiciable black bids for remedies that sound like redistribution, such as reparations for slavery, because they are inherently political. How is it that racial rights are neither political nor economic? Anti-discrimination law and its rights of racial recognition are further embedded in an implicit division of labor in the legal academy. Scholarship in the legal fields that claim centrality in regulating capitalism, such as business associations, securities regulation, contract and property, including intellectual property, has been largely untouched by CRT. Instead, the law of capitalism is studied and taught primarily through the race-free lens of law and economics, an analytic code well suited to neoliberal governance. Stephanie Mudge identifies three faces of neoliberalism: intellectual, bureaucratic, and political. The political face of neoliberalism insists that market-oriented methods and institutions of governance are invariably preferable over state-oriented ones, justifying this policy bent in the language of efficiency and moral hazard. The familiar neoliberal trope that market relationships are efficient and therefore better at allocating scarce resources, except to the extent that the state has introduced regulatory burdens on production and exchange, is part and parcel of a long-standing assignment of freedom to the sphere of the market and coercion to the sphere of the state. Law and economics, when it first emerged in the legal academy, adopted this story wholeheartedly, embracing economists' disregard for history and society. The legal scholar who did the most to establish law and economics in the legal academy, Richard Posner, a professor at the University of Chicago Law School and a judge on the Federal Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, conceived it as the application of economic principles to legal rules. His popular and influential textbook, The Economic Analysis of Law, first published in 1973, sought to demonstrate that Anglo-American common law rules do and should operate to foster economic efficiency. Posner's vision of the economic analysis of law, one contemporary reviewer wrote, provides a virtually distortion-free vision of individual behavior and the market, a fuzzier view of collective decision-making, and almost completely filters out issues of equity. His basic premises are that legal rules and institutions should be designed to facilitate economic efficiency, that they should make the greatest use of competitive markets, and, in the absence of such markets, should mimic what competitive markets would do. Despite this reviewer's skepticism and the many scholarly attacks to follow, this version of law and economics quickly achieved hegemony in legal scholarship and teaching. Its fit with the professional mission of producing lawyers to serve political and economic elites was admirably close. Law and economics perfectly suited the position of neoliberal governance that unfettered market competition produces incentives for maximizing overall resources and individual responsibility, thereby making society better off in the long run, in spite of harsh short-term effects on some people. Translated into cost-benefit analysis, law and economics became an important regulatory tool in the neoliberal administrative state. Allied with a right-wing distrust of dependency, it helped discipline the presumably feckless receivers of government benefits. Imparted to law professors and federal judges in summer camps and weekend workshops generously funded by the conservative Olin Foundation and the Heritage Foundation, and to law students, judicial clerks, and young lawyers attending Federalist Society events, law and economics became a lingua franca of governance. Neoliberalism, of course, represents only one position in a long-standing oscillation in liberal capitalist democracies over the proper relationship between state and market governance. Democratic socialism and social democracy, roughly represented in the 2019 presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, respectively, represent very different resolutions of the same challenge. Important as this war of position is, however, the struggle over the relationship between government and the market leaves invisible the extent to which both state and market governance are embedded in race and gendered subjection. In the 1980s, critical race theorists began to explore the relationship between white supremacy and state governance in the United States. Derek Bell, for instance, argued that fidelity to white supremacy is a bedrock value in the public spheres of American politics and American constitutionalism. A torrent of CRT scholarship since then has tried to show how the Supreme Court has designed anti-discrimination law not only to avoid redistribution at all costs, but also to protect white supremacy by creating enclaves marked private or social in which it can flourish. But until very recently, precisely because of the success with which racial rights have been severed from economic rights, and markets, rhetorically, severed from the domain of state power, critical race theorizing has remained largely disconnected from the law of capitalism. 2. Racial capitalism and legal code. In the wake of recent multiple catastrophic failures of neoliberal governance, legal scholars have begun, once again, to conceptualize economic governance as historically specific, beholden to state power, and situated in cultural and social context. In other words, for these scholars, there's a thing called capitalism again. Moreover, some of these scholars have begun to link the history of capitalism with the history of race, exploring, for example, how the legal tools of finance emerged in slavery and indigenous dispossession, and how the law of private property has been a crucial tool for disrupting indigenous political economies and reshaping First Nations into clients of settler states. Recent scholarship also shows how basic legal concepts, including nation-state, citizen, sovereignty, property, and person, emerged from the crucible of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery. As the literature of racial capitalism develops in history and the other humanities, its themes are ripe for development by legal scholars. Consider, for example, the story of the Great Recession of 2008. As Emma Coleman Jordan notes, the Federal Reserve has disclaimed any role in economic inequality in the United States. Yet its failure to recognize the role of racial discrimination in shaping the U.S. housing market contributed to its policy failures before and after the catastrophic collapse of the U.S. housing bubble, and it ensured the continued disproportionate extraction of wealth from black households. Mirza Baradaran's work exposes the myth of black capitalism, showing how law and policy in housing, employment, and the banking system have made it impossible for institutions to close the racial wealth gap by capturing the black dollar. Daria Rothmeyer's work explores the lock-in effects of racialized dispossession and extraction. Bernadette Atuahany's work on dignity takings, as well as her writings on U.S. state and local governance through fines and fees as a system of racial extraction, dovetails with these accounts of how racial capitalism functions in the present day. More work in this vein is needed, and more that moves beyond U.S. borders. Neoliberalism, after all, is a transnational project. For example, the industrial food system presents a riveting case study of the international nexus of capital, colonialism, and white supremacy. Legal scholars, versed in the laws of immigration, labor, human rights, and international trade, have just begun to explore these connections. As the COVID-19 pandemic unfolds, it similarly unveils the interaction of racial capitalism and public health within the United States and beyond. Finally, as political and economic governance dematerialize and become further datafied, it is important to understand how these dematerialized relations interact with prior regimes of racial capitalism. Critical race scholars and others have already begun to explore the codification of racism within seemingly neutral computer algorithms developed by commercial firms and sold or leased to government agencies. What happens in other realms of governance, where the dissolution of the individual and its replacement by the dividual meet embodied necropolitics? In addition to generating more case studies of the centrality of white supremacy to political and economic governance, scholarship on racial capitalism and law has the potential to make theoretical interventions into the underlying code of liberal capitalist democracy. Feminist legal theorists have already begun to do this work, arguing that a concept of gender as pre-political has helped constitute legal governance of both the state and the market. The idea is not just that women are discriminated against in labor markets, but that the conceptual space of the market is already gendered. Are there similarly systematic relationships between race and the law of capitalism? The new scholarship on racial capitalism opens the door to possible answers. We are back in the territory of semantics, but words matter. Are the terms racial and capitalism capacious enough to realize the full potential of this scholarship? For example, another corner of the Legal Academy is beginning to investigate the ecological dynamics in which state, market, and society are embedded. Influenced by recent writing in political ecology, some legal scholars have called for green critical legal theory. Might the literature in legal racial capitalism connect this work to decolonial theory through, for example, genealogical accounts of the human? Other legal scholars are developing links to indigenous political philosophy, including from South America and Aotearoa, New Zealand. If racial capitalism is understood broadly, the uneasy standoff between people of color and indigenous people as legal subjects might finally be ended. Beyond the possibilities of transdisciplinary scholarship in the academy, the emergence of racial capitalism in law has the capacity to hasten transformations within political economy. In recent years, for example, a series of social movements taking the form of ex-justice have emerged. Movements such as environmental justice, reproductive justice, land justice, water justice, data justice, and climate justice make use of legal strategies and discourse, but simultaneously exceed them. As these movements have built denser interconnections and more complex analytic frameworks, they have begun to converge on a vision that links liberation struggles across the globe with a robust critique of capitalism that centers on its inability to deliver a viable future. From a legal perspective, this work involves not only fighting the bad, as movement lawyers have always done, but building the new, a project that includes promoting cooperatives in place of corporations as the default legal structure for economic production, promoting transformative justice processes as replacements for the carceral state, and developing new practices for the legal protection of the non-human entities and systems with which human life is interdependent. Just as CRT, moving through capillaries within and outside law, has made intersectionality a common word, a racial capitalism literature that engages with law may help advocates dream into being new forms of governance adapted to a more just and sustainable future. Conclusion. In its capacity as a tool for maintaining order, the law has, in partnership with economics, ruthlessly adopted commitments that have fostered and protected racial capitalism. Yet the law is also porous and open-textured. Social movements and community lawyers regularly use the discourse of justice, law's other face, in the service of liberation. In the academy, racial capitalism scholarship that engages with law can move forward the critical project of eroding the structures of power and knowledge that ally political economic institutions and activities with white supremacy and settler colonialism. Outside the academy, but in alliance with it, lawyers and organizers who understand the implications of racial capitalism have the capacity to smuggle at least some of its critical power into the citadels of political and economic governance, and more important, to begin building the other worlds we know are possible.
Introduction. The Old History of Capitalism. Destin Jenkins and Justin Leroy. The argument of this volume is simple. Racial capitalism is not one of capitalism's varieties. It does not stand alongside merchant, industrial, and financial as permutation, phase, or stage in the history of capitalism writ large. Rather, from the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade and the colonization of the Americas onward, all capitalism, in material profitability and ideological coherence, is constitutive of racial capitalism. In other words, we reverse the basic assumption that racial subjugation is a particular manifestation of a more universal capitalist system. The purpose of this argument is not to claim ownership over the field of capitalism studies or to narrow inquiries about capitalism to those that focus explicitly on race. To acknowledge capitalism as racial expands rather than particularizes our sense of what capitalism is. Racial capitalism also asks us to recognize that seemingly race-neutral archetypes of capitalism are, in fact, thoroughly racialized. After all, what is the ubiquitous white working class if not a subject of racial capitalism? Why racial capitalism? It has become a kind of common sense that the 2008 financial crisis, subsequent bank bailouts, and the second Gilded Age of unprecedented income inequality helped generate interest in and support for academic work on the history of capitalism. For some historians who do not work on race, capitalism became a topic of renewed interest at a moment when the logics of capitalism seemed to be breaking down. In other words, when capitalism was no longer working for its presumptive, universalized, white working, or middle-class subjects. While a handful of scholars rigorously interrogated the racial dynamics at the heart of the so-called subprime mortgage crisis and the web of race, debt, and financial innovation at its heart, many commentators, both academic and popular, did not. The notion that a racial critique of capitalism must always be subordinate to a more universal critique has been an analytical problem since Marx. And much of the post-2008 scholarship on the history of capitalism has developed in ways that continue to reduce race to an epiphenomenon, to superstructure, to particular example, rather than general principle. The financial crisis came as Americans were asking whether the election of Barack Obama meant the end of race. That the question could be raised at all in the midst of a highly racialized economic crisis suggests the extent to which discussions of race and capitalism have been divorced from one another. If such questions did not seem disingenuous in 2008, they certainly do a decade later, amid the resurgence of open white supremacy and racial revanchism under the presidency of Donald Trump. And although it is abundantly clear that we are not in a post-racial era, the insistence that white support for Trump and his policies can be explained by economic anxieties confirms the need to separate race from capitalism operates as an analytical instinct and ideological strategy shared by liberals and some leftists alike. The devastating effects of the subprime crisis for communities of color, and the ways in which racialized economic predation was one of its major components, compelled scholars and activists to take up questions of racial capitalism. Even if it does not use the term explicitly, or uses it only in passing, recent work on the prison industrial complex has illuminated the reinforcing process of criminalization, labor extraction, and profit. The movement for Black Lives has mobilized renewed understandings of the relationship between anti-Black violence and economic immiseration, and indigenous movements have fought the logic of economic development in the name of native sovereignty and environmental protection at the Dakota Access Pipeline, Alberta tar sands, and Mauna Kea. These and other examples suggest an urgent need to understand the intersections of white supremacy, race, colonialism, and capital. The purpose of this volume is to offer genuinely dynamic accounts of the historical relationship between economic relations of exploitation and the racial terms through which they were organized, justified, and contested. Put another way, we hope the flexible yet analytically rigorous uses of racial capitalism here, and the debates and arguments they elicit, will clarify the term and be of use to intellectuals and organizers in the political struggles of today and tomorrow. Debating racial capitalism. Definitional debates are a hallmark of the historiography of capitalism, no less so in current than in classic scholarship. There are many varieties of capitalism, and an insistence on a pithy definition deserves to obscure as much as it illuminates. To draw too sharp a distinction between capitalist and non-capitalist is usually to willfully mystify how capitalism works by ignoring that which is necessary but falls outside capitalism's own definitional terms. Among the recent work, an important but contested intervention has been to place an emphasis on explaining how capitalism works rather than setting out to define precisely what capitalism is. Although resisting definitions completely can naturalize capitalism and render it ahistorical, overly narrow definitions produce an exclusionary effect. That said, racial capitalism is the process by which the key dynamics of capitalism, accumulation, dispossession, credit, debt, production, surplus, capitalist worker, developed, underdeveloped, contract, coercion, and others, become articulated through race. In other words, capital has not historically accumulated without previously existing relations of racial inequality. This process functions in two ways. First, the violent dispossessions inherent to capital accumulation operate by leveraging, intensifying, and creating racial distinctions. Second, race serves as a tool for naturalizing the inequalities produced by capitalism, and this radicalized process of naturalization serves to rationalize the unequal distribution of resources, social power, rights, and privileges. Racial capitalism is a highly malleable structure. It has at times relied on open methods of exploitation and expropriation that wrench racialized populations into capitalist modes of production and accumulation, such as slavery, colonialism, and enclosure. But racial capitalism also relies on exclusion from those same modes of production and accumulation in the form of containment, incarceration, abandonment, and underdevelopment for a racial surplus population. The maintenance of racial capitalism can even rely on the limited inclusion and participation of racially marked populations. By extending credit and political rights to these populations, the pervasive racial capitalism recedes, entrenching itself through obfuscation. Cedric Robinson established the dominant critical understanding of racial capitalism in Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Originally published in 1983, Black Marxism remained a relatively obscure text until its republication in 2000, which introduced a new generation of readers to the language of racial capitalism. But while Robinson popularized the term, he did not invent it. The term first cohered around the struggle to end apartheid and white supremacy in 1970s South Africa, provoking contentious debate among intellectuals and activists. Some used racial capitalism to explain the unique racial economic conditions of South Africa, while others dismissed it as a ruse by white Marxists seeking to make race the invention of class conflict. The term
Sample complete. Ready to continue?